The sound of 30 angry voices carried across Willowbrook Estates as Margaret Chen stood firm at her back gate, holding the manila folder that would change everything. The HOA board, once so smug, now looked pale and cornered, exposed for what they truly were. Behind her, the sparkling pool wasn't just water, it was proof that their greed had met its match. Have you ever wondered what happens when entitled bureaucrats finally meet someone who refuses to back down? Well, you're about to find out. Drop a comment to tell us where you're watching from. And if you love stories where the little guy wins, hit that subscribe button. Margaret Chen was living the dream she'd worked 37 years to achieve. The morning sun filtered through her kitchen window as she sipped her coffee, watching the steam rise from the surface of her heated pool. At 54, Margaret had finally reached that sweet spot in life where her electrical contracting business was thriving. Her mortgage was nearly paid off, and her weekends belonged to nobody but herself. The pool had been her reward to herself. After decades of crawling through attics and rewiring industrial buildings, her hands scarred from countless hours of honest work. Every morning she'd stand at that same window, breathing in the scent of chlorine mixed with honeysuckle from her garden, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from earning something through pure determination and sweat. The property itself was Margaret's pride and joy, a corner lot she'd specifically chosen for its privacy and space. She'd personally supervised every inch of the pool installation, from the initial excavation to the final tile work, ensuring it was positioned entirely within her property lines with a full 10-foot buffer from any boundary. The original survey from 2018 sat safely in her filing cabinet, every measurement documented and certified by Hartwell, IMS, Associates, the most reputable surveying firm in the county. Her neighbors had always been cordial, occasionally commenting on how beautiful the pool looked from their upstairs windows, but never once suggesting it was anything other than Margaret's private sanctuary. She'd hosted exactly 3 pool parties in 5 years, small gatherings with her closest friends and her elderly mother, keeping the music low and the festivities respectful of her neighbors' peace. But Margaret should have known that peace never lasts when vultures start circling overhead. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in March, when she found a crisp white envelope tucked under her front doormat. The Willowbrook Estates HOA letterhead stared up at her like a bureaucratic threat, all official fonts and gold embossing designed to intimidate. Inside, a form letter signed by Patricia Whitmore, HOA president, requested Margaret's presence at an informal discussion regarding community amenities and property boundaries. The language was vague enough to be meaningless, but Margaret's contractor instincts immediately went on high alert. In her experience, when people used words like informal and community amenities in the same sentence, someone was about to get screwed. Margaret had encountered Patricia Whitmore exactly twice before, both times at mandatory HOA meetings, where Patricia held court like some suburban monarch, dispensing wisdom to her subjects. Patricia was the kind of woman who wore pearl earrings to grocery store runs and spoke in the clipped, condescending tone of someone who'd never worked a day of manual labor in her life. Her husband owned 3 car dealerships across the county, which apparently qualified Patricia as an expert on property management, community relations, and anything else she felt like controlling. She lived in the largest house in Willowbrook Estates, a gaudy McMansion with more square footage than sense, positioned strategically where she could monitor the comings and goings of her neighbors like a suburban spy. The informal discussion was scheduled for the following Saturday at 10 a.m. in Patricia's living room, because God forbid the HOA actually rent a proper meeting space for their power plays. Margaret arrived precisely on time, her work boots replaced with clean sneakers but her guard fully raised. Patricia's living room was a monument to excess, all cream-colored furniture and crystal knickknacks that screamed, "Look, but don't touch." Present were Patricia herself, Vice President Brad Morrison, and Secretary Janet Liu, all sitting in high-backed chairs arranged to face a single folding chair that was obviously meant for Margaret. The setup reminded Margaret of a tribunal, which, as it turned out, wasn't far from the truth. "Margaret, thank you so much for coming," Patricia began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We wanted to discuss what we see as a wonderful opportunity for community enhancement." She gestured toward a folder, thick with papers, and what looked like architectural drawings. "Several residents have brought to our attention the beautiful pool facility on your property, and we've been exploring ways to maximize its benefit for the entire Willowbrook community. Margaret felt her stomach drop as the implications hit her like a sledgehammer to the gut. These people weren't just admiring her pool from a distance, they were actively plotting to take it away from her. "I'm sorry. What exactly are you suggesting?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. Patricia's smile widened, the predatory grin of someone who thought they held all the cards. "Well, we've had a professional survey conducted, and it appears that a significant portion of your pool facility actually extends into what should be community common area." She slid a document across the coffee table with the flourish of a magician revealing their final trick. "According to our findings, the eastern edge of your pool is built on property that, according to the original Willowbrook Estates plat, should have been designated as shared recreational space." Margaret picked up the survey with hands that betrayed none of the fury building in her chest. The document was signed by someone called Pinnacle Property Solutions, a company she'd never heard of, with measurements that contradicted everything she knew about her own land. According to this new survey, her property line ran directly through the middle of her pool, making half of it allegedly community property. It was such obvious bullshit that Margaret almost laughed. Except there was nothing funny about three people sitting in judgment of her life's work, based on fraudulent paperwork. "This is interesting," she said finally, her electrician's mind already cataloguing the inconsistencies she could spot without even standing up. "But I have my own survey from when the pool was installed, and it shows something completely different." "Oh, we're aware of your survey," Janet Liu interjected, her voice carrying the smug certainty of someone who'd never been challenged on anything in her life. "But that was conducted by a different firm, and frankly, surveying standards have improved significantly since 2018. She exchanged a knowing look with Patricia, the kind of glance that said they'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. "Pinnacle Property Solutions is one of the most advanced surveying companies in the state, using GPS technology and laser measurement systems that simply weren't available when your original survey was conducted." It was a masterful blend of technical jargon and condescension, designed to make Margaret feel stupid for questioning their expertise. But Margaret hadn't spent 4 decades in construction by being easily intimidated by fancy terminology. "That's fascinating," she replied, setting the fraudulent survey back on the coffee table. "I'd love to meet with this Pinnacle Property Solutions team and have them explain their methodology." She watched Patricia's face carefully, noting the tiny flicker of uncertainty that crossed her features. "In fact, I think it would be valuable for all of us to have a joint meeting with both surveying companies, so we can compare their findings side by side." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from an electrical fire, and Margaret could practically see the wheels turning in Patricia's head as she tried to figure out how to avoid exactly that scenario. "Well, that's not really necessary," Patricia said quickly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the desperation underneath. "We have full confidence in Pinnacle's findings. And frankly, Margaret, we're not looking to create conflict here." She leaned forward in her chair, adopting the patronizing tone of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "We're simply trying to find a solution that benefits everyone in the community, and that means making better use of our shared resources." The word shared came out like a slap in the face, and Margaret realized with crystal clarity that this wasn't a negotiation. It was a hostile takeover, wrapped in flowery language and fake concern. Brad Morrison, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke up with the enthusiasm of someone who thought they were delivering good news. "The beautiful thing is, Margaret, you wouldn't lose access to your pool at all." He gestured grandly, as if he were offering her a gift instead of stealing her property. "You'd simply be sharing it with your neighbors during designated community hours, say 3 to 7 p.m. on weekdays and 10 to 6 on weekends." His smile was the kind of empty, corporate expression that Margaret had seen on the faces of property developers trying to convince small business owners to sell their buildings for half their value. "Think of it as expanding your social circle while contributing to the overall property values of our lovely community." The audacity was so breathtaking that Margaret had to take a moment to process what she'd just heard. These people had fabricated a survey, held a secret meeting to plan the seizure of her property, and were now presenting the theft as some kind of generous compromise. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Margaret said. her voice taking on the dangerous calm that her employees knew meant someone was about to get fired. "You're claiming that half of my pool, which I paid for, planned, and built entirely on my own property, actually belongs to the community." She looked around the room, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "And your solution is for me to give up my private use of my own property for the majority of every single day?" Patricia's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the entitled fury that had been simmering underneath her fake politeness. "Margaret, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation here," she snapped, her voice rising to the imperious tone of someone who was used to getting her way through sheer force of personality. "The HOA has legal authority over all community property issues, and if you continue to obstruct our efforts to resolve this matter amicably, we'll be forced to pursue other options." The threat hung between them like a live electrical wire, crackling with the promise of lawyers and court battles and all the expensive misery that comes with bureaucratic warfare. "I'm sure you don't want this to become a legal issue, do you?" Margaret stood up slowly, the folding chair creaking under the shift of her weight, and looked down at the three people who thought they could intimidate her into surrendering her property. "Patricia," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd managed construction crews for decades, "I think there's something you need to understand about me." She picked up the fraudulent survey and folded it once, the paper crackling like kindling. "I didn't build my business by backing down from bullies, and I sure as hell didn't build my pool to hand it over to a bunch of wannabe dictators with fake surveys." The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the ticking of Patricia's ostentatious grandfather clock. "You want to make this a legal issue? Bring it on." The walk back to her house felt like a victory march, even though Margaret knew the real fight hadn't even started yet. She could feel Patricia's eyes burning into her back from the living room window, could practically hear the emergency phone calls that would be made before she even reached her front door. But Margaret had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Every contract dispute and every dealing with corrupt city inspectors had been training for exactly this kind of battle. She had documentation, legitimate surveys, receipts for every penny she'd spent on the pool, and most importantly, she had the absolute certainty that comes from knowing you're in the right. Let Patricia and her cronies bring their lawyers and their threats and their fake surveys. Margaret Chen had built her life on a foundation of hard work and honest dealing, and no suburban Napoleon was going to take that away from her. The first volley came exactly 48 hours later, delivered by certified mail with all the ceremony of a declaration of war. The envelope was thick with legal letterhead and official seals, the kind of intimidating package designed to make normal people panic and surrender immediately. Inside, a formal notice from the law offices of Peterson, Brady, Associates demanded that Margaret cease and desist all unauthorized use of community property and submit to a binding arbitration process to resolve the boundary dispute. The language was dense with legal jargon and veiled threats, but the message was crystal clear. Surrender your pool or face the full weight of the HOA's legal machinery. Margaret read the letter twice, once quickly and once slowly, her contractor's mind automatically cataloguing the weak points and empty threats buried in the flowery legal prose. But Margaret had learned long ago that the best defense against bullies was to never fight fair when they started the fight dirty. Her first call was to Tom Martinez, an old friend who happened to be one of the best property lawyers in the county. Tom had helped her through 3 contract disputes over the years, and he had the rare combination of legal expertise and street smarts that came from representing working people instead of corporate interests. "Margaret, what kind of trouble are you stirring up now?" Tom asked when she called, the warmth in his voice immediately putting her at ease. When she explained the situation, Tom's tone shifted to the cold professionalism of someone who'd seen this particular scam before. "Send me everything," he said simply. "Your original survey, their fake survey, all the correspondence, everything. These people just picked a fight with the wrong electrician." While Tom worked on the legal angles, Margaret decided to do some investigating of her own. 37 years in construction had taught her that fake documents always had tells, little inconsistencies that revealed themselves under close examination. She spread the Pinnacle Property Solutions survey across her kitchen table and began studying it with the same attention to detail she brought to complex electrical schematics. The first red flag was the font, the measurements and property descriptions were in a slightly different typeface than the company logo and official headings, suggesting someone had doctored an existing document rather than creating an original survey. The second red flag was even more obvious. The survey claimed to use GPS coordinates, but several of the reference points were listed as being located in positions that would put them in the middle of existing houses. Margaret's investigation took a dramatic turn when she decided to look up Pinnacle Property Solutions online. A simple Google search revealed that the company did exist, but their website was a bare-bones affair with stock photos and generic descriptions that could have been copied from any surveying company in America. More importantly, their listed address was a UPS store in a strip mall 30 miles away, hardly the headquarters of one of the most advanced surveying companies in the state. When Margaret called their phone number, she got a voicemail message that sounded like it had been recorded on a cell phone, promising to return calls as soon as possible. The whole operation reeked of the kind of fly-by-night scam that Margaret had encountered dozens of times in construction, where people created fake companies to provide fake documentation for whatever scheme they were running. But Margaret's real breakthrough came when she decided to drive out to the UPS store and see for herself what kind of operation Patricia had hired to steal her pool. The strip mall was exactly as depressing as she'd expected. A collection of failing businesses and empty storefronts anchored by a discount grocery store and a check cashing place. The UPS store was wedged between a nail salon and a store that sold nothing but phone cases, its windows covered with advertisements for shipping services and mailbox rentals. Margaret walked in and asked the teenage clerk if Pinnacle Property Solutions received mail there, and was told that yes, they had a mailbox. But no, they had never actually come in to pick up any mail. Weird, right? The kid said, popping his gum. We've had maybe 3 pieces of mail for them in 6 months, and they're all still sitting in the box. Armed with this information, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She called the county assessor's office and requested a meeting with the senior surveyor, a woman named Linda Harrison who had been mapping property boundaries for over 20 years. Linda agreed to meet Margaret at her house the following Tuesday, bringing along the original plat maps and boundary surveys that had been used to establish Willowbrook Estates in the first place. When Linda arrived, she took one look at the Pinnacle survey and started laughing, a deep professional chuckle that told Margaret everything she needed to know. "Honey," Linda said, shaking her head, "whoever made this thing has never surveyed property in their life." She pointed to a dozen different errors in the document, from impossible GPS coordinates to mathematical calculations that didn't add up to measurements that violated the basic laws of geometry. "The biggest tell," Linda explained, pulling out her own measuring equipment, "is that they claim your pool extends into community property." She showed Margaret the original 1,987 plat map that had been used to divide the land into individual lots. According to the official county records, there had never been any designated community recreational space in that area. Margaret's property line extended a full 15 feet beyond the eastern edge of her pool. "Not only is your pool entirely on your own property," Linda continued, "but you've got enough extra space to build another pool if you wanted to. The fraudulent survey wasn't just wrong, it was impossibly, laughably wrong. The kind of amateur-hour fakery that wouldn't fool a first-year surveying student." Margaret felt the righteous fury building in her chest as the full scope of Patricia's scheme became clear. This wasn't just about the pool, it was about testing whether Margaret would roll over and submit to whatever the HOA demanded. If she gave in now, there would be no end to their encroachments on her property and her rights. Next, they'd claim her garden was community green space, or her driveway was actually a community walkway, or her house itself was somehow infringing on their imaginary authority. Patricia and her cronies had declared war on Margaret's independence, and they'd made the fatal mistake of bringing fake weapons to a real fight. Linda Harrison proved to be more than just a professional ally. She was genuinely outraged by the fraud she'd uncovered. "Margaret, I've been doing this for 2 decades, and I've never seen anything quite this brazen," she said, carefully documenting every error in the Pinnacle survey with her own equipment. "What they've done here isn't just wrong, it's potentially criminal fraud." She explained that falsifying survey documents was a felony in their state, punishable by significant fines and potential jail time. "More importantly for your situation, I can provide expert testimony that will absolutely demolish their case in any legal proceeding." Linda spent 3 hours at Margaret's house that afternoon, taking measurements, photographs, and detailed notes that would form the foundation of Margaret's counterattack. While Margaret was building her case against the HOA's fraudulent survey, Patricia was apparently escalating her own campaign of harassment. The second wave of attacks came in the form of daily violation notices, each one more ridiculous than the last. Margaret was cited for unauthorized use of community facilities, failure to maintain community property standards, and obstruction of community access to shared amenities. Each violation notice came with a fine ranging from $50 to $200, along with threats of additional penalties if the violations weren't corrected within 10 days. The paperwork piled up on Margaret's kitchen counter like evidence of Patricia's growing desperation, each notice revealing the extent to which the HOA president was willing to abuse her authority to get what she wanted. But Margaret's favorite violation notice was the one that cited her for failure to provide adequate community access to pool facilities. The notice demanded that Margaret immediately install appropriate access gates and signage to allow neighbors to use her pool during designated community hours. It was such a perfect example of bureaucratic overreach that Margaret actually framed it and hung it in her home office, right next to her electrical contractor's license and her small business award from the Chamber of Commerce. If Patricia wanted to play games with official paperwork, Margaret was more than happy to document every single illegal demand for future legal proceedings. The intimidation campaign reached new levels of absurdity when Patricia started sending her husband Chuck to inspect Margaret's property. Chuck Whitmore was exactly what Central Casting would order if they needed a middle-aged car salesman. Soft around the middle, loud Hawaiian shirts, and the aggressive friendliness of someone who made his living convincing people to buy things they didn't need. He would show up at Margaret's front door at random times, claiming he needed to verify compliance with community standards or ensure proper maintenance of shared facilities. Each visit followed the same script. Chuck would try to push his way into Margaret's backyard, while spouting nonsense about HOA authority and community regulations, and Margaret would politely but firmly send him away while taking pictures of his intrusion for her growing legal file. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in early May, when Margaret was enjoying her coffee and watching the sunrise reflect off her pool's surface. She heard the unmistakable sound of her back gate opening, followed by voices and splashing sounds that definitely didn't belong in her private sanctuary. Margaret rushed outside to find Patricia herself leading a group of 5 neighbors on what appeared to be a guided tour of community facilities. The sight of strangers walking around her pool area, pointing and commenting as if they owned the place, filled Margaret with a cold rage that surprised her with its intensity. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing construction sites. "But you're trespassing on private property." Patricia turned around with the serene confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable, her smile as fake as the survey she'd used to justify this invasion. "Margaret, we're simply conducting a community assessment of our shared recreational facilities," she said, gesturing toward the pool, as if she'd personally installed every tile. "As HOA president, I have the authority to ensure that all community property is being properly maintained and utilized." The other neighbors looked uncomfortable, clearly uncertain about the legality of what they were doing, but Patricia pressed on with the manic determination of someone who'd committed too much to back down now. "We're particularly interested in developing a maintenance schedule and usage guidelines that will benefit everyone in Willowbrook Estates." Margaret looked at the group of trespassers standing around her pool and made a decision that would define the rest of this conflict. "You have 30 seconds to get off my property before I call the police," she said, pulling out her phone and holding it where everyone could see. "This is my private pool on my private property, and you are all trespassing." The uncomfortable neighbors immediately started moving toward the gate, clearly wanting no part of whatever legal trouble was about to unfold, but Patricia stood her ground with the stubborn defiance of someone who'd never been held accountable for anything in her life. "Margaret, you're making a serious mistake," she said, her voice rising to the shrill pitch of someone whose authority had been challenged. "The HOA will not tolerate this kind of obstruction, and there will be consequences for your actions." "The only consequences," Margaret replied, already dialing 911, "are going to be for the people who are trespassing on my property right now." The call was brief and professional. Margaret identified herself, explained that several people were trespassing on her private property and refusing to leave, and requested police assistance. The dispatcher promised to send an officer within 10 minutes, which was exactly enough time for Patricia to realize that her bluff had been called in the most public and humiliating way possible. The other neighbors had already fled through the gate, leaving Patricia alone in Margaret's backyard like a general whose army had deserted her on the battlefield. "This isn't over, Margaret," Patricia said, her voice shaking with fury as she finally headed for the gate. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Officer Maria Santos arrived exactly 9 minutes later, a compact woman with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent years dealing with suburban disputes and petty neighborhood drama. Margaret met her at the front door and walked her through the entire situation. From the fraudulent survey, to the escalating harassment campaign, to the morning's trespassing incident. Officer Santos listened carefully, taking notes and asking pointed questions about documentation and evidence. When Margaret showed her the fake Pinnacle survey, Officer Santos examined it with the trained eye of someone who'd seen plenty of fraudulent documents in her career. "This is interesting," she said finally, her tone carrying the professional skepticism that made criminals nervous. "Would you be willing to file a formal complaint about the trespassing and the fraudulent survey?" Margaret didn't hesitate for even a second. "Absolutely," she said, feeling the satisfaction that comes from finally taking decisive action against bullies and thieves. Officer Santos explained the process for filing complaints about both trespassing and fraud, and promised to follow up with Patricia about the morning's incident. "Between you and me," she said as she prepared to leave, "I've dealt with HOA disputes before, and this one has all the hallmarks of someone who's gotten way too comfortable with pushing people around." She handed Margaret her card and suggested that any future incidents should be reported immediately. People like this usually back down once they realize there are actual consequences for their actions. The police report that Officer Santos filed that afternoon became the catalyst that transformed Margaret's private dispute into a very public reckoning. Within hours of the report being filed, Margaret received a panicked phone call from Janet Liu, the HOA secretary, claiming that there had been a misunderstanding about the pool situation and asking if they could meet to work out a reasonable compromise. The sudden shift from threats and intimidation to desperate negotiation told Margaret everything she needed to know about how seriously Patricia was taking the fraud investigation. "Janet," Margaret said, her voice carrying the cold satisfaction of someone who held all the cards. "The time for compromise was before your president trespassed on my property with a fake survey." She declined the meeting and suggested that all future communication should go through her lawyer. Tom Martinez called Margaret that evening with news that confirmed her suspicions about Patricia's growing panic. "They blinked," he said, the satisfaction clear in his voice. "Peterson, Brady, associates called this afternoon, asking if their client could withdraw the arbitration demand without prejudice. In lawyer speak, that meant the HOA wanted to pretend the whole thing had never happened, and hoped Margaret would forget about the fraud, trespassing, and months of harassment. I told them that ship had sailed the moment their client started using fraudulent documents and committing crimes," Tom continued. "We're not withdrawing anything, and we're adding criminal fraud charges to our complaint." But Margaret's investigation into Pinnacle Property Solutions was about to reveal something even more damaging than simple fraud. Working with Linda Harrison and Tom Martinez, Margaret had traced the fake surveying company back to its origins, and what they found was a web of deception that went far deeper than one HOA president's quest to steal a swimming pool. Pinnacle Property Solutions had been created specifically for the purpose of providing fraudulent surveys to HOA boards, property developers, and anyone else who needed official-looking documents to support land grabs and zoning violations. The company had been involved in at least a dozen similar schemes across 3 counties, always following the same pattern: create fake surveys that served their clients' purposes, collect payment, and disappear before anyone could verify the documents. The revelation that Patricia had hired a criminal organization to commit fraud on her behalf opened up entirely new avenues of legal action. Tom Martinez filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office, the County District Attorney, and the state board that regulated surveying companies. Each complaint was meticulously documented with evidence that Linda Harrison had helped compile, creating a paper trail that connected Patricia directly to what was essentially a criminal conspiracy. "Margaret," Tom explained during one of their strategy meetings, "what we have here isn't just a civil dispute about property boundaries." He spread the evidence across his conference table like a prosecutor preparing for trial. "This is criminal fraud. conspiracy, and potentially racketeering if we can prove she's done this before. The investigation into Patricia's past behavior revealed exactly what Tom suspected: a pattern of using fraudulent documents and intimidation tactics to seize control of community property throughout Willowbrook Estates. Working with Linda Harrison, Margaret obtained copies of every property survey and boundary dispute that had occurred in the neighborhood over the past 5 years. The pattern was unmistakable. Whenever Patricia wanted to claim private property as community space, a survey would appear from Pinnacle Property Solutions or similar fly-by-night companies, always showing exactly what Patricia needed to justify her land grab. 3 other homeowners had lost parts of their yards to Patricia's schemes, and 2 had been forced to move rather than fight expensive legal battles they couldn't afford. Margaret realized she wasn't just fighting for her pool, she was fighting for every neighbor who'd been victimized by Patricia's suburban dictatorship. Armed with this evidence, Margaret made a decision that would transform her from a victim into a community leader. She called each of the homeowners who'd been scammed by Patricia's fraudulent surveys and offered to share her legal and surveying resources to help them recover their stolen property. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People who'd been isolated and intimidated by Patricia's machine suddenly found themselves part of a coalition with the resources and expertise to fight back effectively. Tom Martinez found himself representing not just Margaret, but a group of 6 homeowners who'd all been victimized by the same fraudulent surveying scheme. Linda Harrison provided expert testimony showing that every single Pinnacle Property Solutions survey was fraudulent, often in ways that were so obvious they bordered on comedy. The criminal investigation moved faster than anyone expected, largely because Patricia's schemes had been so brazen and poorly executed that they left evidence everywhere. Detective Ray Johnson from the County Fraud Unit interviewed Margaret on a Wednesday afternoon, spending 3 hours going through every document and piece of evidence that had been compiled over the past months. Detective Johnson was a 20-year veteran who specialized in white-collar crime, and he recognized the hallmarks of organized fraud immediately. "Miss Chen," he said after reviewing all the evidence, "what you've uncovered here is a textbook case of organized fraud." He explained that Pinnacle Property Solutions was already under investigation in 2 other counties, and Margaret's evidence would be crucial in building a comprehensive case against what appeared to be a multi-county fraud operation. The dominoes started falling faster than Patricia could possibly have anticipated. Within a week of Detective Johnson's interview, search warrants were executed at Patricia's house, Chuck's car dealership, and the UPS store mailbox that served as Pinnacle Property Solutions headquarters. The search of Patricia's home office revealed a treasure trove of evidence that connected her not just to the pool scheme, but to years of fraudulent surveys and document forgery throughout Willowbrook Estates and beyond. Her computer contained email exchanges with the criminals behind Pinnacle Property Solutions, complete with instructions on how to falsify specific measurements to support her various land grabs. Most damaging of all were the spreadsheets that documented her systematic campaign to seize private property from homeowners she perceived as weak or vulnerable. Margaret watched the investigation unfold with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd been proven absolutely right about everything she'd suspected. The local newspaper picked up the story after Patricia's arrest, running a front-page article titled, "HOA President Charged in Multi-County Fraud Scheme." The article detailed not just the pool incident, but the entire pattern of fraudulent surveys and property theft that Patricia had orchestrated over nearly a decade. Phone calls started pouring in from homeowners across 3 counties who'd lost property to similar schemes, each one adding another layer to what was becoming one of the largest suburban fraud cases in state history. Margaret found herself at the center of a growing movement of victims who were finally able to fight back against years of systematic abuse. But Patricia wasn't going down without a fight, and her desperation led her to make increasingly erratic and dangerous decisions. 2 days after her arrest, she made bail and immediately launched what could only be described as a scorched earth campaign against Margaret and anyone else who dared to challenge her authority. She filed a dozen frivolous lawsuits, claiming everything from defamation to conspiracy, each one designed more to harass and bankrupt her opponents than to achieve any legitimate legal goal. She organized a group of loyal HOA supporters to picket outside Margaret's house, carrying signs that accused her of destroying community unity and attacking neighborhood values. Most seriously, she began making increasingly specific threats about what would happen to people who continued to interfere with community governance. The threatening behavior escalated to the point where Officer Santos recommended that Margaret file for a restraining order, and Detective Johnson suggested that Patricia's bail conditions should be modified to prevent her from contacting any of the victims. "Ms. Chen," Detective Johnson explained during one of their regular check-ins, "people like Patricia Whitmore don't handle losing control very well." He showed Margaret copies of text messages and emails that had been recovered from Patricia's phone during the investigation, revealing a pattern of increasingly unhinged behavior directed at anyone who'd opposed her schemes. "We're taking this very seriously, and I want you to call us immediately if she tries to approach you or your property again." Margaret's restraining order hearing became a public spectacle that drew media attention from across the county. Patricia showed up with her own lawyer and a group of supporters who filled half the courtroom, all of them apparently convinced that Margaret was somehow the villain in this story. But when Tom Martinez presented the evidence of Patricia's fraud, trespassing, and ongoing harassment campaign, the judge's reaction was swift and decisive. "Ms. Whitmore," Judge Patricia Hernandez said, looking down from the bench with the stern disapproval of someone who'd seen enough fraudulent schemes to last a lifetime, "the evidence presented here shows a clear pattern of criminal behavior and escalating harassment." She granted the restraining order and added additional conditions that prevented Patricia from coming within 500 feet of Margaret's property or contacting her in any way. The legal victory was satisfying, but Margaret knew the real test would come when the criminal case went to trial. Patricia had hired an expensive criminal defense attorney who was already laying the groundwork for a defense based on claiming that she'd been misled by Pinnacle Property Solutions and had no knowledge that their surveys were fraudulent. It was a strategy that might have worked if Detective Johnson hadn't found those damning email exchanges on Patricia's computer, complete with detailed instructions on how to falsify specific measurements to support her land grabs. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Patricia's high-priced lawyer was reportedly pushing for a plea bargain rather than risking a trial that could result in serious prison time. Meanwhile, Margaret was discovering that her fight against Patricia had turned her into something of a local celebrity and community organizer. Homeowners from across the region were reaching out to her for advice on fighting HOA overreach and fraudulent surveys, and she found herself speaking at community meetings and homeowners' rights seminars. Her story had struck a nerve with people who felt powerless against bureaucratic bullies and corrupt officials, and she was being invited to share her experience with groups fighting similar battles in their own neighborhoods. "Margaret," Linda Harrison told her after one particularly well-attended seminar, "what you've done here is bigger than just saving your pool." She gestured toward the audience of homeowners who were taking notes and asking detailed questions about property rights and survey fraud. "You've given people the tools and the courage to fight back against this kind of corruption." The community impact of Margaret's fight became even more apparent when the Willowbrook Estates HOA held its annual election. Patricia, still facing criminal charges and bound by a restraining order, was obviously not eligible for re-election, but the entire board structure that had enabled her fraud was up for review. Margaret decided to run for HOA president herself, not because she wanted the power, but because she wanted to ensure that no future Patricia could abuse the position to steal from her neighbors. Her platform was simple: transparency in all HOA business, legitimate surveys for any property disputes, and an end to the intimidation tactics that had characterized Patricia's reign. The election wasn't even close. Margaret won with over 80% of the vote, and her slate of reform candidates swept every position on the board. Patricia's criminal trial was scheduled for September, but her legal troubles were mounting faster than her expensive lawyers could handle them. The state attorney general's office had filed additional charges related to her connection with Pinnacle Property Solutions, and the FBI had opened an investigation into what appeared to be a multi-state fraud operation targeting HOA communities. Each new revelation made Patricia's position more desperate and her behavior more erratic, culminating in an incident where she was arrested for violating the restraining order by driving past Margaret's house repeatedly while making threatening gestures. Her bail was revoked, and she spent the final months before trial in county jail, watching her suburban empire crumble from behind bars. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic after everything that had led up to it. Patricia's lawyer had negotiated a plea bargain that included restitution for all the property owners she'd defrauded, community service, and 2 years in state prison. But Patricia, apparently unable to accept that her schemes had finally caught up with her, rejected the plea deal and insisted on going to trial. It was a decision that her lawyer obviously advised against, but Patricia's ego wouldn't allow her to admit guilt or show any remorse for the damage she'd caused. The trial lasted 3 days, with witness after witness testifying about Patricia's fraud schemes and intimidation tactics, while Linda Harrison provided expert testimony that methodically destroyed every aspect of the fraudulent surveys. Margaret's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, a detailed account of Patricia's escalating campaign of harassment and fraud that painted a clear picture of someone who'd abused her position of authority for personal gain. "Your Honor," Margaret said, looking directly at the jury as she concluded her testimony, "what Patricia Whitmore did wasn't just about stealing my pool." Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd fought this battle and won. She created a system where honest homeowners were afraid to challenge her, where private property could be seized with fraudulent documents, and where anyone who stood up to her faced harassment and intimidation. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later provided the final resolution that Margaret had been seeking since that first fraudulent survey appeared under her door. Judge Hernandez sentenced Patricia to 4 years in state prison, followed by 3 years of probation, and ordered her to pay full restitution to all the homeowners she'd defrauded. The financial penalties were substantial enough to force the sale of Patricia's gaudy McMansion, with the proceeds going to compensate her victims for their legal costs and property losses. "Ms. Whitmore," Judge Hernandez said as she pronounced the sentence, "you have shown a complete disregard for the property rights and personal dignity of your neighbors." She looked down at Patricia, who sat slumped in her orange jumpsuit, finally stripped of all the authority and arrogance that had defined her reign of terror. "Your actions have damaged not just individual families, but the entire concept of community governance." Margaret walked out of the courthouse that day feeling something she hadn't experienced since the whole ordeal began: complete and total peace. Her pool was secure, her property rights were protected, and Patricia Whitmore was facing the consequences of her criminal behavior. More importantly, the precedent that had been set would protect countless other homeowners from similar fraud schemes in the future. Detective Johnson, who'd become something of a friend during the long investigation, shook her hand on the courthouse steps. "Margaret," he said, the respect clear in his voice, "what you did here took real courage." He gestured toward the courthouse where Patricia's criminal career had just ended. 3. A lot of people would have just given up and let her steal their property, rather than fight back. The changes in Willowbrook Estates were immediate and dramatic. Margaret's first act as HOA president was to hire Linda Harrison to conduct legitimate surveys of all the disputed properties that Patricia had claimed over the years, restoring stolen land to its rightful owners and compensating families who'd been forced to move because of the fraud. The HOA's new board implemented strict transparency requirements for all future surveys and property disputes, ensuring that no future board member could abuse their position the way Patricia had. Most importantly, they established a community fund to help homeowners fight back against any future attempts at property theft or bureaucratic overreach. Margaret's pool became something of a symbol of resistance in the neighborhood, not because it was community property, it never was, but because it represented the principle that honest people shouldn't have to surrender to bullies and thieves. She occasionally invited neighbors over for pool parties, but only when she wanted to, and only people she genuinely liked. The pool remained exactly what it had always been, her private sanctuary, earned through decades of hard work and defended through months of legal warfare. Every morning, she still stood at her kitchen window with her coffee, watching the steam rise from the heated water, and feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from winning a fight you never wanted but absolutely had to have. The ripple effects of Patricia's downfall extended far beyond Willowbrook Estates. The FBI investigation into Pinnacle Property Solutions led to the arrest and prosecution of a network of fraudulent surveying companies operating across 5 states, all of them targeting HOA communities, where homeowners were vulnerable to official-looking documents and bureaucratic intimidation. Margaret found herself testifying before state legislative committees about the need for stronger penalties for survey fraud and better protections for homeowners facing HOA overreach. Her story became part of a growing movement to reform HOA governance and hold community leaders accountable for their actions. Linda Harrison, who'd become both a friend and a professional ally during the fight, helped Margaret establish a non-profit organization dedicated to helping homeowners fight fraudulent surveys and property theft. The organization, which they called the Property Rights Defense Fund, provided free consulting services to families facing similar schemes and maintained a database of known fraudulent surveying companies. Within a year of its founding, the organization had helped recover over $2 million in stolen property and had been instrumental in the prosecution of dozens of fraudulent surveyors and corrupt HOA officials. "Margaret," Linda said during one of their quarterly board meetings, "what started as your fight for your pool has become a movement that's protecting property rights across the entire region." The personal satisfaction of victory was enhanced by the knowledge that Patricia's suburban dictatorship had been permanently dismantled. Chuck Whitmore, deprived of his wife's protection and facing his own fraud charges related to his car dealership business, had fled the state and was reportedly living in a trailer park in Arizona. The other HOA board members who'd enabled Patricia's schemes had either moved away or were facing their own legal consequences for their role in the fraud. Most importantly, the culture of fear and intimidation that had defined Willowbrook Estates during Patricia's reign had been replaced by a genuine sense of community cooperation and mutual respect. Officer Santos, who'd been the first law enforcement official to take Margaret's complaints seriously, stopped by the house on the one-year anniversary of Patricia's arrest. She was off duty and brought her own family to enjoy a barbecue by the pool that had started it all. "You know, Margaret," she said as they watched their kids playing in the water, "in my 15 years on the force, I've never seen a case that started with such a simple complaint and ended up exposing such a massive criminal operation." She raised her beer in a toast to the pool that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. "This whole thing proves that sometimes the system actually works when good people refuse to back down from bullies." Margaret's daily routine hadn't changed much since the beginning of this ordeal. She still started each morning with coffee by the kitchen window, still worked on her electrical contracting projects, still enjoyed quiet evenings by her pool. But everything felt different now, infused with the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever challenges life throws at you. She'd discovered that the skills that made her successful in construction, attention to detail, refusal to accept shoddy work, and the determination to see projects through to completion were exactly the same skills needed to fight corruption and defend her rights. The pool was still her private sanctuary, but now it was also a reminder that honest people, with the courage to stand up for themselves, could defeat even the most entrenched systems of abuse and fraud. The final chapter of Patricia's story came 2 years later, when she was released from prison on parole after serving her minimum sentence. Margaret heard through the grapevine that Patricia had moved to another state and was reportedly working as a cashier at a discount grocery store. Her days of wielding authority over other people's lives permanently ended. The news brought Margaret no particular satisfaction. She'd never been motivated by revenge or personal animosity, just by the simple principle that thieves and bullies shouldn't be allowed to steal from honest people without consequences. Patricia had faced those consequences. The stolen property had been restored to its rightful owners, and the system that had enabled her abuse had been permanently reformed. As Margaret stood by her pool on that warm summer evening, watching the sun set over Willowbrook Estates, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she'd been a private person who just wanted to enjoy the fruits of her hard work in peace. Now she was a community leader, a property rights advocate, and someone who'd proven that individual citizens still had the power to take on corrupt systems and win. The pool that Patricia had tried to steal was still exactly where it had always been on Margaret's property. Maintained by Margaret's labor, enjoyed at Margaret's discretion. But it had become something more than just a swimming pool. It was a symbol of the principle that in America, honest work and legitimate ownership still meant something, and that those who tried to steal from their neighbors would face justice. Margaret never forgot the lesson that this experience had taught her. That freedom isn't free, and that the price of maintaining your rights is eternal vigilance against those who would abuse their authority to take what doesn't belong to them. She kept Linda Harrison's phone number on speed dial, Tom Martinez on retainer, and Officer Santos's card in her wallet, knowing that the same networks of support that had helped her defeat Patricia's schemes were still there for any future challenges that might arise. Most importantly, she'd learned that the best defense against bullies and thieves wasn't just individual resistance, but community organization and mutual support among honest people who refused to be intimidated. The Property Rights Defense Fund that Margaret and Linda had established continued to grow. helping dozens of families each year fight back against fraudulent surveys, corrupt HOA officials, and other schemes designed to separate honest homeowners from their property. Each success story reinforced Margaret's belief that Patricia's downfall hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a larger battle between those who believed in honest work and legitimate authority, and those who thought they could use their positions of power to steal from their neighbors. The fund's success rate was remarkable. Over 90% of the cases they took on resulted in the restoration of stolen property and the prosecution of the fraudsters responsible. Margaret's story had become something of a legend in property rights circles, told and retold at homeowners' meetings and legal seminars across the region. But she remained modest about her role, always emphasizing that her victory had been possible only because of the support she'd received from professionals like Linda Harrison and Tom Martinez, and law enforcement officials like Officer Santos and Detective Johnson, who'd taken her complaints seriously. The system worked. She would tell audiences who came to hear her speak, but only because good people were willing to do their jobs honestly and help someone who was willing to fight for what was right. The legacy of Margaret's fight extended beyond property rights and criminal justice reform. Her willingness to stand up to Patricia's intimidation had inspired other residents of Willowbrook Estates to become more engaged in community governance, leading to higher voter turnout in HOA elections and more transparency in all community decisions. The neighborhood had transformed from a place where residents lived in fear of their HOA board to a genuine community where neighbors looked out for each other and worked together to solve problems. Property values had actually increased since Patricia's removal, as buyers sought out neighborhoods with transparent governance and strong property rights protections. As Margaret prepared for bed on this anniversary of her victory, she walked through her house, turning off lights and checking locks. The same routine she'd followed for years. But when she passed the window that looked out over her pool, she paused for a moment to appreciate what she'd fought to defend. The pool lights cast dancing reflections on the water's surface, creating patterns of light and shadow that reminded her of the complex battle she'd waged and won. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to help her neighbors protect their own property rights. But tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that honest work, legitimate ownership, and the courage to stand up to bullies still meant something in America. The pool was still hers, the community was still safe, and Patricia Whitmore was still paying the price for her crimes against the people she was supposed to serve.